Alrighty, here recording for Pod38. Today I'm going to be taking another detour from my normal Page of Plato content to discuss more things that I've been reading in the Game of Thrones universe. I just finished the 3 Duncan Egg novellas, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, which starts with the Hedge Knight, which I presume the Hedge Knight is going to be the basis for Season 1 of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, the HBO show that is to be put out this year. So, obviously excited about any sort of Game of Thrones content coming to television, especially given the long delay between Seasons 2 and 3 of House of the Dragon, which I think is less than ideal, and I could spend some time complaining about Hollywood not getting these productions done more quickly, but that's a little bit like howling at the moon. It's kind of what's the point? So instead of doing that, I want to discuss some of the things that I thought were the most interesting after reading, especially the novellas. And then I am currently on page 97 of A Dance with Dragons, so I'm making my way through the last novel from the Game of Thrones universe. And then I've read, I've got here too, The World of Ice and Fire. I've got the Fire and Blood Part 1, so I'm basically coming towards the end of the written content that is available for a Game of Thrones reader. And so it's possible I'm going to go back through, maybe even do content here discussing either theories or I doubt I would do close reads of the books because, read them yourself, and then also there's literally a television show if you want to see other versions. I don't know what the interest would be in something like that. But for today, I guess what prompted my interest in particular is reading a Tyrion chapter in A Dance with Dragons, and Tyrion is traveling with Iliomapatis, however his last name is pronounced, Varys' homie, and so he tells the whole story that I've heard a bajillion times in the actors' sort of narrations from the DVD extras. I think that's what that content comes from originally, to know basically the relationship between Varys and Ilio, who is he's a lord of Bravo. He's somewhere in Bravos. He's got a large mansion that he hides Tyrion in. If you've seen the TV show, you're well aware of Tyrion getting to Illyrio's manse, and then, I think he's there with Varys though, which Varys is not present in with Illyrio, and actually, I've already had it spoiled for me what the epilogue of Dance with Dragon is, so unfortunately I have some suspicions as to where Varys is or where he's going to end up, especially relative to Kevin Lannister, but that notwithstanding, because that's honestly a bit of a spoiler, even though I haven't said the whole thing, but what was most interesting is that Illyrio and Tyrion are then traveling along Valyrian roads. They're riding through the hills of Andalos, and then I think one of the details that makes George R. R. Martin and his universe so interesting and unique is just the characters, the depths that they reach as far as, I would have never expected from my knowledge of the show and then my knowledge of Tyrion up to this point, I would have never figured that Tyrion had a phase during his childhood where he was devoted to the religion, the faith of the Seven, etc., that he, read the 7 Pointed Star, whatever the fucking book is called, but, he's so familiar that he's repeating these stanzas from these religious texts, etc., and obviously nobody's unaware that Tyrion is an intelligent character, but obviously, he's a character that has a lot of depth, and then, it's not just because he's a Lannister, and, even when Tywin puts him on, like, the on the side of the army where he basically knows Tyrion is likely to die and all these things, and then Tyrion goes into battle basically several times in the first few books, and I think acquits himself pretty well, especially for a dwarf, and so he's definitely a very interesting, compelling character. And then you see his playing of the Game of Thrones, his hand to the king, and it's very interesting. You know, the scene where he sits the Iron Throne and receives the peace terms, quote unquote, from Robb Stark, and then sends back his reply with sort of an attempt to essentially bust Jaime out of his thing. So, you know, very interesting character as far as Tyrion's concerned. And then I just would have never seen that little twist that essentially before he met his previous wife, Tysha, that he had been a religious child in terms of just being oriented to it for whatever reason, and he discusses it with Illyrio and their trip. And so I just would have never made that connection, or I guess to put it a different way, if I were writing the Game of Thrones books, that's not a detail that would have come to mind for me to insert and be like, well, you know, Tyrion, why is his behavior this way? Well, he's got a religious background. Like, that's sort of next level creative thinking. And so I think you gotta give George all his flowers for that sort of character creation, etc. And then reading from A Dance with Dragons in that Tyrion chapter, and so Illyrio and him are talking, and so they're discussing a guy named Griff, and I'm pretty sure young Griff is apparently the either the fake or real version of Aegon Targaryen, whatever. But it's not important in my opinion. I've seen the show. No, it's not important. But so he says, I would trust Griff as I would trust a brother, and Tyrion says, another mortal error, then I shall do likewise. So I think what's really interesting in all the Tyrion chapters I've read so far in A Dance with Dragons is, again, the character building. George is really taking the time to take you through the perspective, especially of Tyrion, that and Cersei, I would say, are pretty similar in this sense that I think you can make some comparison between this and a sort of Duskendale affair sort of episode where it's like, yeah, that's something that kind of broke that character mentally and started to send them a little more towards the realm of insanity. And I think it seems to me that Tyrion is likely to recover from this, that he's going to process his trauma essentially more effectively than Cersei, who, in my opinion, in her chapters, she's a complete mess, because she's on the one hand trying to basically be her father, but on the other hand, she's trying to go her own way, and then on the other hand, she's just way too crazy for her own good, trying to do way too many things as queen, just way out over her skis. And that's why she's obviously been captured by the Faith Militant, and that's kind of an example of her madness, where she empowered them, and then therefore she's responsible for the fact that they put him in better sort of situations. So she's doing that on her end. And then what I thought was really interesting reading Tyrion, to know that Tyrion and Cersei are not twins, so they don't have that similarity chapter to chapter, but they're still siblings. And I think what I've observed of Tyrion is that this guy is super traumatized by killing Tywin, and he's going through it so many times, and hearing the sort of noise of the thump of loosing the bolt and then it hitting Tywin, and him imagining shooting Tywin in different places, and what Tywin was doing. Oh shit, he was standing up, he was coming after me. Like, I only say that to give George more flowers in terms of the character building in these chapters, where right? Like, Tyrion's talking to Illyrio, he's dealing with these people, etc. But this guy is also so out of his mind. But he has the sort of dual-minded track to be able to continue to keep up an appearance while he is seemingly reeling from an emotional perspective to a pretty substantial degree. I mean, I'm not going to go through and count, but the amount of times he basically rehears and re-sees him shooting Tywin with the crossbow is crazy enough. So, anyway, so they're having a conversation, and then Illyrio says the Golden Company marches toward Volantis as we speak, there to await coming of our queen out of the east, beneath the gold, the bitter steel. I was looking for that quote. So here Tyrion is told that the Golden Company is marching to Volantis, and again they're waiting for Dany to come out of Meereen, where she is in the pyramid, trying to get her situation together. And then so the Golden Company is waiting for her, and Tyrion then remarks basically the slogan of the Golden Company, beneath the gold, the bitter steel, which refers to Aegor Rivers, who's a legitimized great bastard of Aegon IV Targaryen. And basically in this podcast I'm going to try to go over a lot of that history, because to bring it back though to the Duncan Egg novellas really quickly, I think the Duncan Egg novellas kind of, for the first time in my mind, have kind of they've made important the Blackfyre Rebellion sort of phase of the Westeros' history. In other words, previous to reading the novellas, I almost viewed the Blackfyre storyline as kind of a weird storyline as far as the entire series was concerned. And I think part of that is informed by the television show not even including the fake Aegon that I guess we're going to meet later in A Dance with Dragons. But and I'm looking forward to that. But you know, if this character wasn't in the television show, that is a very strong indication that it's really not an endgame storyline. It's much more likely, basically, that Jon Snow is going to ride a dragon than it is that this fake Targaryen is going to do that. So, anyway, though, but, so Tyrion then responds, I had heard the Golden Company was under contract with one of the free cities. Mirror, Illyrio smirked. Contracts can be broken. There's more coin and cheese than I knew, said Tyrion. How did you accomplish that? The Magister waggled his fat fingers. Some contracts are written in ink, some in blood, I say no more. So, before I read the next Tyrion paragraph, which kind of analyzes that, but to break it down a little bit. So, Illyrio is telling Tyrion that the Golden Company has broken a contract with Myr, that this is obviously something that would be very costly, and then Illyrio points to, well, you know, the price is really a matter of blood. And so I think from a fan theory perspective, you could take a little too much away from that, and then I think say, well, clearly then this young Griff character that they're going to meet, he has to therefore be a Blackfyre, whether of the maternal line or whatever the situation is. But clearly he's, I mean, from a fan's perspective, to believe that that the Aegon that was allegedly brained to death in the sack of King's Landing is still alive doesn't seem very likely or credible, and therefore anybody pretending to be him is clearly aping that for whatever reason. And then, you know, it's what I'm saying is that if Illyrio has these alliances he's trying to make between Dorne and this person, that person, and who's going to marry who, etc., then what I think it implies is at least the possibility that whoever this young Griff character is, that they are a Blackfire in sort of the tradition of the Blackfire rebellions, which I only really got to see sort of materialized for the first time in the Dunk and Egg novellas, which is why I thought they were so particularly good as storytelling, because they really helped me learn about a period of the Targaryen history that I hadn't known anything about previously. And then when I think you start to see, it's like the tragedy of Baelor Breakspear essentially being the first novella, and then the second novella essentially being sort of showing you the various sides of the Blackfire Rebellion, the one and the other, and how it has defined things going forward. And then the third one with sort of the traitor's wedding, the bringing in of the new Blackfire to, try and seize the throne, whatever. Then, all the different characters you see from Baelor and Maekar in the first novella. Then, obviously, the other characters in the second novella are, not to say they're not as important, I don't think they're nearly as important. And then in the third novella, there's a lot of characters who are really important, and I think, in particular, one character I became interested in was this Quentin Ball Fireball character, and I started having certain theories about that. So I will go through that particular idea at some point, because I think it's worthwhile. But so to read the Tyrion chapter to sort of analyze this whole thing. So the dwarf pondered that Golden Company was reputedly the finest of the free companies, formed a century ago by Bittersteel, bastard son of Aegon the Unworthy, when another of Aegon's great bastards tried to seize the Iron Throne from his true-born half-brother. Bittersteel joined the revolt. Daemon Blackfire had perished on the Redgrass Field, however, in his rebellion with them. Those followers of the Black Dragon who survived the battle, yet refused to bend the knee to Daeron, fled across the narrow sea. Among them, Daemon's younger sons, Bittersteel, and hundreds of landless lords and knights suddenly found themselves forced to sell their swords to eat. Some joined the Ragged Standard, some joined the Second Sons, or the Maiden's Men. Bittersteel saw the strength of House Blackfire scattering to the four winds, so he formed the Golden Company to bind the exiles together. From that day to this, the men of the Golden Company had lived and died in the disputed lands, fighting for Myr, or Lys, or Tyrosh in their pointless little wars, dreaming of the land their fathers had lost. They were exiles and sons of exiles, dispossessed and unforgiven, yet formidable fighters still. So, that's a lot of details. We'll go over it again with more details from the world of Ice and Fire before I go through any of the stuff from the Dunk and Egg novellas themselves. But so Tyrion says, I admire your powers of persuasion, he told Illyrio. Had you convinced the Golden Company to take up the cause of our sweet queen when they have spent so much of their history fighting against the Targaryens? So here, this is why, another flower for George, the consistency that Tyrion is smart. He's straight up smart. Whether he does crazy things from now and again, or he seems a little crazy at this point in time, this guy is sharp as a tack. And what he says is, he says, I admired your powers of persuasion. How did you convince the Golden Company to fight for the Targaryens? Every Blackfire rebellion has been against the Targaryens on behalf of House Blackfire. And so Illyrio brushed away the objection as if it were a fly. Black or red, dragon is still a dragon. When Meleys the monstrous died upon the stepstones, it was the end of the male line of House Blackfire. Cheesemonger smiled through his forked beard, and Daenerys will give the exiles what Bittersteel and the Blackfires never could. She will take them home. With fire and sword, Tyrion, it was kind of homecoming that Tyrion wished for as well. 10,000 swords makes for a princely gift I'll grant you. Her grace should be most pleased. Magister gave modest bow of his head, chin's jiggling, I'd never presumed to say what might please her grace. So Tyrion says, thinks prudent of you. Tyrion knew much more about the gratitude of kings. Why should queens be any different? Soon enough, the magister was fast asleep, leaving Tyrion to brood alone. He wondered what Barristan Selmy would think of riding into battle with the Golden Company during the War of the Nine Penny Kings. Oops, wrong music. Can't have that playing. Let's just put on something new. But, so during the War of the Nine Penny Kings, Selmy cut a bloody path through their ranks to slay the last of the Blackfire pretenders. Rebellion makes for queer bedfellows, and none more queer than this fat man and me. So, then, right after this, Tyrion tells the story of his religious background once. Illyrio tells him, this is Andalos, my friend. But, so Tyrion's kind of trying to juggle a lot of the things that he's being told here, where, he's being told, like, Barristan Selmy is in Dany's Queensguard. This dude who's seemingly trying to ingratiate himself to the queen is gonna send her the Golden Company. How is there gonna be chemistry between the Golden Company and the dude who killed a bunch of them? This is why Tyrion's a very interesting character. And so then, I'm currently in the Quentin Martell chapter, so I'm assuming that Quentin Martell is gonna sort of come upon these people and start to discover them. We're just gonna have this sort of world be more explicated. But I'm gonna go first through some of the content I saw in the World of Ice and Fire, then potentially go through some of the content from the Duncan Egg novellas, and then basically go over this little idea that, I'm no TV producer, but I just kind of came up with an idea for a story or a storyline, and I'm interested to sort of talk it out and try and get some sort of ideas on the table in this format. So I have the World of Ice and Fire book open to Daeron II Targaryen, 184 after Aegon's conquest, when Aegon IV dies. So son and heir Prince Daeron is crowned by the High Septon. He starts fixing the things that Aegon was doing wrong previously, so that's why he's called Daeron the Good. And then characters like Tywin Lannister will use Daeron II as an example to Tommen in the TV show, telling him, like, it's not good enough to just be a good king. You have to be strong, good, and wise, and wisdom is really the thing that everything flows from. And therefore, if you don't have the wisdom, you're not going to be able to make much use of the other skills. If you're for example, if you're Robert Baratheon, you basically only have the strength, or you're Baelor the Blessed and you only have the piety, or you're Daeron, you only have the goodness. It's not good enough. You have to have the holistic combination of all of these factors. And me going through that is kind of bringing up the problems of Daeron II taking the throne, because I think what happens is Daeron ends up marrying the Princess of Dorne. Let me read this. So, yet his realm was not marked solely by the question of the great bastards or even Aegon's misrule. His marriage to Miriel of Dorne, now Queen of the Seven Kingdoms, been happy and fruitful. One of his earliest significant acts after assuming the throne was to begin negotiations with his good brother, Prince Mairon, to unify Dorne under Targaryen rule. So, then Mairon marries Daenerys once she's of age, which, I think, spoiler alert, that pisses off Daemon Blackfire because Daemon Blackfyre is in love with Daenerys, which is not our Daenerys Targaryen from the TV show, but an earlier Daenerys. And so basically Daeron, not only does he cut off kind of the possibility of placating Daemon Blackfyre in that way, even though they go over it like he's going to give him lands, and I don't know if it's that he raises Summerhall, but whatever the situation is where Daeron II basically and then no, actually Darren raised Summerhall, so that's interesting. But basically what happens is everyone's pissed off about concessions to the Dornish, and so even though he's called Darren the Good and he's got 4 sons, etc., and so it looks like the Targaryens are in a strong place, but then certain things which almost go to the sort of the racial or ethnic component of this world building is like, as we've seen in the House of the Dragon show, when you've got when you have Targaryen children, and Laenor Velaryon's children are last name Velaryon, but once Jacaerys, who never will, but if he would have taken the Iron Throne, he would have taken the Iron Throne as a Targaryen per Viserys Targaryen's instructions, and therefore, there's basically a big deal when you can tell that the Targaryen heir doesn't quite look like a Targaryen, and that's sort of the situation with Baelor Breakspear, the heir to Daeron, his eldest son, where he essentially looks Dornish. So Baelor Breakspear is as Targaryen, frankly, as most Targaryens are likely to get, although you really can make the argument, though, and this is what I'm going to assume if George R.R. Martin was to ever sort of expand on this part of the world building, it's like somebody had to have essentially gotten into, and this is going a little far in front of what I was talking about. I haven't introduced this idea enough to talk about this guy, because we didn't go through Aegon IV specifically, but so Daemon Blackfyre, originally Daemon Waters, is one of the great bastards of Aegon IV, except he's not a bastard with a mistress. He's actually a bastard of Aegon IV Targaryen with, and I'm forgetting her name, but whichever one of the 3 Targaryens that were locked in the Maiden Vault by Baelor, the quote-unquote blessed, weird guy seemingly, but he basically locks his sisters up. Boom, one of them's pregnant. He goes into a fast, trying to figure out what happened. He dies. What an idiot. And then, then Aegon says, well, Aegon IV says, oh, that was me, but I'll claim that. But so Daemon, I think what you can sort of take away from that in particular is that Daemon I think what the argument will be made is that he is a more pure Targaryen, because he doesn't have a drop of Dornish blood in him. Both his parents are Targaryen. Like, it satisfies more of the weird incesty sort of aspects of things. And then I think from a Dragon's Dreams perspective, what you can say is, certainly seems from the TV shows and what we know from the books, that a lot of these princes and princesses of House Targaryen have these prophetic dreams where they see partial versions of things happening out and about, and a lot of them seemingly have seen versions of the Daenerys Targaryen story as far as they're aware of. They're somewhat aware of Dany's existence, but they're not aware necessarily that Dany's somebody other than themselves. So I think several of the Targaryens will think, whether it's Daemon himself or others, they think that either they or their particular children are going to be the persons of prophecy. This extends all the way down to even to Rhaegar and, whoever his children are. And so, I guess to go through the Daemon Blackfyre. So one of the natural children came from a woman not accounted as a mistress, Princess Diana the Defiant. I wonder if that's a Princess Diana joke, but Dana the Defiant. But Daemon was the name Dana gave the child, for Prince Daemon had been the wonder and terror of his age. So, Daemon Targaryen from House of the Dragons. And in later days, it was seen as a warning of what the boy would become. Daemon Waters was his full name when he was born in 170 AC. At that time, Dana refused to name the father, but even then, Aegon's involvement was suspected. Raised at the Red Keep, this handsome youth was given the instruction of the wisest maesters and the best maesters at arms at court, including Sir Quentin Ball, the fiery knight called Fireball. He loved nothing better than deeds of arms and excelled at them, and many saw in him a warrior that would one day be another dragon knight. King Aegon knighted Daemon in his 12th year, when he won a squire's tourney, thereby making him the youngest knight ever made in the time of the Targaryens, surpassing Maegor I, and shocked his court, kin, and council by bestowing upon him the sword of Aegon the Conqueror, Blackfyre, as well as lands and other honors. Daemon took the name Blackfyre thereafter. And then it it goes through the fact that essentially not only is Daemon older than Daeron, but Daeron is... So, Nerys, who is Aegon's his sister, I guess, and Aegon the Fourth, the unworthy, never loved her, and so only had one trueborn child by her, which was Prince Daeron, and but so then they had to continue to perform those duties because and then so matters were inflamed further by Prince Aemon, their brother, who'd been inseparable from Nerys when they were young. Aegon's resentment of his noble celebrated brother was plain to all, for the king delighted in slighting Aemon and Nerys both at every turn. Even after the Dragon Knight died in his defense and Queen Nerys perished in childbirth the year after, Aegon IV did little to honor their memory. So then they're kind of going forward with the idea that actually, I'm just going to read this because it's interesting. So the king's quarrels with his close kin came all the worse after his son Daeron grew old enough to voice his opinions. The false accusations of the queen's adultery made by Sir Morgul Hastwyck were instigated by the king himself, though at the time Aegon denied it. These claims were disproved by Sir Morgul's death in a trial by combat against the Dragon Knight Aemon. These accusations came at the same time as Aegon and Prince Daeron were quarreling over the king's plans to launch an unprovoked war against Dorne. Surely no coincidence. It was also the first but not the last time Aegon threatened to name one of his bastards as heir instead of Daeron. After the death of his siblings, King began to make barely veiled references to his sons alleged illegitimately, something he dared only because the Dragon Knight was dead. His courtiers and hangers-on aped the king, and this calumny spread. So, basically, as long as Aegon was on the throne, there was this balance of Aegon or Aemon the Dragon Knight essentially being on his Kingsguard and therefore sworn to him, but also when Aegon essentially instigates the insulting of the memory of Nerys, who I guess Aegon suspected that Nerys actually, that their child Daeron was actually the child of the Dragon Knight, etc. And again, well, why is this the case that he's, so convinced of this, etc.? Is it just paranoia? But then we've got, a similar sort of analogy being made where there's sort of a king that people view as unworthy for whatever reason. Aegon because he can't control himself, and then Daeron because he's weak. And then you look at them and you say, well, there's somebody right there who is essentially the more virtuous Targaryen. Therefore, if it was anything merit-based, then that person would, inherit the throne and have all these things. And then there's the slight difference of Aemon, the Dragon Knight, being a member of the Kingsguard. So he doesn't have these sort of family-related issue. Like, he's not going to have a Blackfyre family that's going to be haunting the Targaryens forever, whereas when Aegon legitimizes Daemon Waters, makes him Daemon Blackfyre, gives him lands, and all these sorts of things, then you would say that, Aegon has created something that's going to be a much more longer-term problem. And so then to go through, like, the mistresses of Aegon, so there's 9 of them and a lot of other women, but I don't really want to even dive here too deep into the sort of Bracken versus Blackwood sort of matter, because that really defines a lot of the Bittersteel versus Bloodraven thing, and I don't want to get too much into that, but I think what you can see is, though, so Aegon the Fourth had created this realm where, he had empowered the Blackfyres, and he'd done all these things, and he'd really kind of divvied up the rule of the 7 kingdoms by essentially dividing the kingdoms against himself, by continuing to sort of press the illegitimacy of the person sitting the throne. Then, reasonable or not, opportunistic or not, this is going to lead certain lords to essentially try and test whether they ought to essentially rebel, whether somebody else ought to be on the throne. And then you can just factor in all the things of, like, oh, well, look at this weak king giving the Dornish all of these privileges, etc., etc., etc. Why, we've got a pure Targaryen over here who could sit the Iron Throne, would actually be strong. And then I think one thing that's important to say is an important element. We'll see if this comes out as a detail at any point. So, if, let's say, Daemon Blackfyre were to have been one of the Targaryens, and to call him a Targaryen is, I think, legitimate, because he's literally like the ultimate Targaryen. He looks like Aegon the Conqueror. He's the product of 2 Targaryens. Like, he could hardly get more Targaryen, except he was born outside of the bonds of marriage, and therefore he's not legitimate until he's legitimated by the king, etc. And so one thing would be interesting, they list some of the characters that are around Daemon Blackfyre, and they mention in particular, they mention where is it? Well, they mention Quentin Ball. They call him Fireball. And so they mentioned that Quentin was super important to the development of Daemon Blackfyre, and whether it was Fireball himself, whether it was Bittersteel, Aegor Rivers, who again, he's another Targaryen. Now, he's not he's a Targaryen in the same sense that Bloodraven is, which Bloodraven is another Targaryen, but they're both legitimized great bastards because the one of them's a Bracken, the other one's a Blackwood. I'm sure George could write another story where I'd suddenly care about the Brackens and the Blackwoods, but let's just leave that for now because don't want to get too far afield. But obviously building on that natural rivalry to create the rivalry between Bittersteel and Bloodraven. Then to give sort of a long and short of it, I think Bittersteel's family essentially tried to ingratiate themselves such that their mistress would become the queen, and therefore they overstepped, and therefore Bittersteel's line basically is more removed from the sort of they're basically not the closest to the king, especially once Daeron takes the throne after Aegon dies, which all the bastards are legitimized. That's great, but he still never overturned who his actual heir was, though he said, if the king basically instigated somebody to try to prove by trial at combat that the Dragon Knight essentially was the one who was actually the father of Daeron, and therefore Daeron's illegitimate, number one, it's like, who's going to believe Aegon the Fourth? Got a bit of a credibility problem there, and then so there's the knock-on effects where essentially Bittersteel, Bitter the Steel, he becomes that way because he's a legitimate great bastard who is pushed to the side a bit, and then Bloodraven then becomes a more powerful counselor. He gets more access, and then by the time somebody like Aerys the First is on the throne, at that point the rest of the realm is basically saying, well, kind of like Tywin to Aerys the Second, Bloodraven is the real power in the realm. He's the real person that you have to contend with, etc. And so, in that case too, what it seems to have resulted in is a very divided and ununified realm where essentially at any point in time there's going to be bunches of traitors that are just going to sort of pop up out of nowhere for one Blackfire rebellion after another, and therefore what you say is Bloodraven, it was powerful enough to take the Seven Kingdoms and hold it, but he was not powerful enough to make them prosperous and to, whether it's dealing with sort of the Ironborn or some of these other things where it's just like, it's basically become apparent to people that if you're not, in the capital essentially, well, Bloodraven will certainly, put a Septon to death if he hears him talking shit, but he can't do much more than, create this sort of realm of terror. He doesn't have that sort of ability to really be in all places at all times, make things the way they need to be, and therefore, that's sort of a weakness of rule that is sort of at play with a guy like Bloodraven, who seems like he has so much power. And then I guess I'm going to be looking forward to when I get to finally meet Bloodraven in as the Three-Eyed Crow, whenever Bran Stark finally gets there, because I just had, Cold Hand said he's going to take Bran to a wizard essentially, and so obviously it's going to be Bloodraven. And so what's interesting about Bloodraven is, so from what we know about Bloodraven, and this will be, this is even before the Dunk and Egg novellas, so it's the Battle of the Redgrass Field. But what essentially happens is that the Blackfires and the Targaryens fight, or the Loyalists, if you want to call them that, and then essentially Daemon Blackfire has a duel with Wayne Corbray, whatever his name is, the Corbray with sister, or Lady Forlorn, the Valyrian steel sword, and he and he and Daemon Blackfire have it out, and obviously Daemon is, basically the warrior with his sword, and so he eventually defeats Corbray, and then the way it's presented in the novellas is that while that was all happening, Bloodraven had taken a ridge and basically set him up such that once Daemon defeated Corbray, then Daemon essentially, he can ride over that dude, and then he can just press the attack, and he will have the advantage in the battle. But as a sort of honorable knight would do, he basically gives instructions like, hey, no, we're not gonna ride over him, and I just fought this long duel with him, like, we're gonna treat him with respect, get the guy's body of the mace, or take him to the back, like, whatever you've got to do, which obviously, as a logistical matter, it just takes time and energy, etc., that you're not using to fight. And so there's that aspect where Daemon essentially pauses when he need not have paused, and he pauses theoretically out of respect and a sense of honor, and then it's not necessarily dishonorable, but it's definitely an example of sorcery and potentially sort of evil magic when Bloodraven's Raven's Teeth brigade essentially not a brigade, but their unit, they take a ridge, they take a position, and while Daemon is trying to get the body to be taken back, basically Bloodraven shoots, or has his people shoot with sorcerer's arrows, essentially, the two eldest sons of Daemon, so that they will die, and so that Daemon will essentially have no choice, because he would never abandon his sons. And then Bloodraven just lights Daemon up, and kind of a little bit like I guess we'll see with and I'm blank, Kristen Cole, essentially, when he comes to his end in House of the Dragon, where he's he thinks he's going to be able to fight a battle, a trial, to sort of prove himself, all these things, and then those people are like, nope, we're just going to shoot you. We're going to shoot you a bajillion times and kill you because you've taken enough lives already. And was interesting, something I heard in a video the other day and I'd heard this quote before from Bloodraven, saying, I had a brother I loved, or something, basically a brother I hated, a brother I loved, and a sister I something or other, blah blah blah, referring probably to Shira Seastar, also to Aegor Rivers, aka Bittersteel, the brother he hated. And then I thought it was a good idea, arguably the brother he loves is Daemon Blackfire. Now, maybe not, maybe it's referring to somebody else, but that would be an interesting twist in terms of Bloodraven essentially being forced to sort of kill his a brother that he loves, essentially. And that's an interesting sort of thing to comprehend, would be what would motivate Bloodraven to kill Daemon if, for example, Bloodraven believed that Daemon either was the legitimate king or that he deserved to be king, even though he wasn't legitimate. So the reason that can sort of be brought up, and why I kind of wanted to give the shout out to the Duncan Egg novellas, is just I had never really heard it sort of articulated before, that in this universe, and it's real as a thing in the shows, but I had never really considered it properly, is the fact that essentially a weak king cannot sustain their power. And what makes it difficult is that so you've got Darren II, and I think what we would say of Darren II, if he was good, was not good enough in terms of ultimately not virtuous enough. Now, what does that mean? Is he a good king overall? Maybe. But fundamentally, it's essentially an issue in any sort of society like this, especially if your king is not capable of holding their own. What does that mean? Let's look at the example of Jaehaerys Targaryen, who's arguably the sort of pinnacle example of what it actually meant to be a Targaryen ruler, even greater than potentially Aegon himself, because Jaehaerys ruled longer and essentially accomplished more within his reign. But one of the things you see in Fire and Blood is that even though Jaehaerys took the throne so young that there was essentially a regency, and then Robar Baratheon tried to screw around and stuff, and then it basically takes Jaehaerys taking Rogar down to his dragon to let him know, like, as long as I ride this beast like Vermithor, like, I fucking own you, and you better understand that I don't need to threaten you, I don't need hostages, I don't need this, I don't need that. Your life is literally forfeit to me whether I want it or not. And so what that means is that nobody could, threaten Jaehaerys himself, because whether it was like the Stepstones or whatever the situation is where Jaehaerys like goes out, fights a straight up war, and then beheads whoever the hell, and et cetera, and basically fights trials by combat by himself with Blackfyre, etc. That is what you expect of the king. And then you can hear sort of the narration from Varys in my mind being like, oh, the martial arts that men often mistakenly value in their rulers. And it's like, well, the reason that's important is because at the end of the day, the king or queen needs to be able to execute the law. Essentially, there's something along the lines of a Ned Stark sort of thing, that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. Like, if you're seeing an indication, essentially, that Darren II is potentially illegitimate for a reason that he doesn't appear that he can legitimately hold his own. In other words, if somebody were to sort of mess with Darren himself, Darren could not acquit himself properly. Now, he ends up having the children of Baelor Breakspear and Maekar, where he's got essentially two sons who can both serve as the heir prince, etc. Although I don't think that's Maekar's position until his brother Viserys dies or something like that. But whatever the situation is, he's got two sons who are perfectly capable of acquitting themselves in battle. But then it's like the Battle of the Redgrass Field, and it's not a matter of Darren taking the field himself and inspiring people. It's the fact that his sons were the hammer and the anvil, and that Bloodraven was there. So that, again, that just goes to say that there's something slightly off with a king who, can't do that. And I think one thing you can rejoinder that with is, well, it's more of like an uncivilized thing, isn't it? Like, kind of when you're, beyond the wall with the wildlings and shit, like, those people really value the sort of martial component in itself, but then arguably lacks sort of the organizational components or whatever it might happen to be. But I just think there's something very interesting from the novellas to the idea that a lot of these people in the realm, when they quote-unquote rebelled against the throne, it threw them into confusion, because it's like, oh wait, do we support the Dragon King? Well, the Dragon Kings don't even ride dragons anymore, so we've got that one element, which arguably that will lend into why Aegon V ends up doing whatever happened at Summerhall, where spoiler alert, he's probably trying to provoke an event such as the Dany's coming out of the fire with 3 dragons episode, and then clearly to some extent doing that unsuccessfully because no living dragons emerge. But part of the idea, I guess, for Aegon And you hear it expressed by Egg in the novellas when he's talking about him and Aemon. They spent the time together. We used to dream we could ride around on dragons together, and if it was me and Aemon and we had the dragons, boy, nobody could stop us, etc., etc., etc. And finally be able to combine sort of the legacy of Daeron II, which is essentially being a good king, with the legacy of having the strength in order to hold the realm together in reality. And so, so this is to say that the novellas, what I thought they did most effectively is colored this sort of period of the history with something very compelling as far as what as far as the motivations that could be driving these people. There's so many layers, and again, giving George all the flowers. But so to jump back into the World of Ice and Fire and Daeron II's chapter again. So to go through this, so Daeron's reign quickly stabilized the realm. Soon came to be called Daeron the Good by the small folk and noble lords alike, widely seen as just and good-hearted, even if some questioned the influence of his Dornish wife, and though he was no warrior, descriptions of his era note he was small of frame, thin arms, round shoulders, and a scholarly disposition. 2 of his 4 sons seemed all that could be wished in a knight, lord, or heir. Eldest Prince Baelor won the name Breakspear at the age of 17, following his famous victory at Princess Daenerys' wedding tourney. He defeated Daemon Blackfyre in the final tilt. So again, if Daemon was super pissed about not being married to Daenerys himself, then being defeated by Baelor Breakspear in a tournament, and that's obviously on horses with lances, but that would seem to suggest that, Baelor Breakspear really was all the Targaryen he needed to be, and him defeating Daemon Blackfyre is not him defeating somebody greater than him, but somebody who's on a similar level to him, if not necessarily with, a melee style thing, but in terms of the competition of riding the horses in the tilts. And you see really well in the Dunk and Egg novellas the whole, I guess, why George R.R. Martin loves a tournament, etc., because it gives so much fodder for you to do whatever in terms of storytelling. I mean, the Harrenhal tourney, he could theoretically write that, or somebody could write that someday and spend ages on that. But anyway, so the youngest son, Prince Maekar, also seemed to show similar prowess. And then just a little note, so all of Baelor's children will die, Prince Baelor Breakspear, and Maekar will kill Baelor, quote-unquote, by accident in the tourney with Dunk and Egg and all of them in the first novella. Spoiler alert. But all of the Targaryens that come afterwards will be of the line of Maekar and his children, in particular, through the line of Aegon, who is the egg from Dunk and Egg. So then to continue the World of Ice and Fire. Yet too many men looked upon Baelor's dark hair and eyes and muttered that he was more Martell than Targaryen, even though he proved a man who could win respect with ease and was as open-handed and just as his father. Knights and lords of the Dornish marches began to distrust Daeron and Baelor as well, and began to look more and more to the old days when the Dornishmen were the enemy to fight, not rivals for the king's attention or largesse. And they would look at Daemon Blackfyre, grown tall and powerful, half a god among mortal men, with the conqueror's sword in his possession, and wonder. Seeds of rebellion had been planted, but it took years for them to bear fruit. There was no final insult, no great wrong that led Daemon Blackfyre to turn against King Daeron. If it was truly all for the love of Daenerys, how is it that 8 years passed before the rebellion bloomed? That was a long time to harbor thwarted love, especially when Rohan had already given him 7 sons and daughters besides, and Daenerys had also borne Prince Mehron several heirs. In truth, Seeds found fertile ground because of Aegon the Unworthy. Aegon had hated the Dornish and warred against them, and those lords who desired the return of those days, despite all the associated misrule, would never be happy with this peaceable king. Many famed warriors who looked with dismay on the peace in the realm and the Dornish and the king's court began to seek Daemon out. So, obviously, Bittersteel and some others are going to be some of these. So these are sort of a Knights of Summer situation where it's a real problem. Like if you're one of these virtuous fighters, you don't want to be caught in an era where you've got too good and strong of a king, because then you'll never get a chance to really prove yourself. So, perhaps at first Daemon Blackfyre merely indulged such talk for the sake of his vanity. After all, years had passed between the first men approaching Daeron and the actual rebellion. What then tipped Daemon over into the actual rebellion? It seems likely it was another of the great bastards, Sir Aegor Rivers, called Bittersteel. Perhaps it was his Bracken blood that made Aegor so choleric and so quick to take offense. Perhaps it was the ignominious fall of the Brackens in King Aegon's esteem, leading to his exile from Aegon's court. Perhaps it was only his rivalry with his half-brother and fellow bastard Brynden Rivers, aka Bloodraven, who had been able to maintain his close relations at court, for Bloodraven's mother had been well loved during her life and was fondly remembered, so the Blackwoods did not suffer as the Brackens did when the king cast off his respective mistresses. Whatever the case may be, Aegor Rivers soon began to press Daemon Blackfyre to proclaim for the throne, and all the more so after Daemon agreed to wed his eldest daughter, Kala, to Aegor. Bitter his steel may have been, but worse was his tongue. He spilled poison in Daemon's ear, and with him came the clamoring of other knights and lords with grievances. So we'll get back to the next paragraph in a second. But to go through this sort of sub-paragraph that's written on the previous page, it had been said in the years after Daemon Blackfyre proved to be a traitor, his hatred of Daeron began to grow early. It was Aegon's desire, not Daemon's, that he be wed to Rohan of Tarash. Instead, Daemon had developed a passion for Daeron's sister, young Princess Daenerys. Only 2 years younger than Daemon, the princess supposedly loved the bastard prince in return, if the singers can be believed, but neither Aegon IV nor Daeron II were willing to let such feelings rule in matters of state. Aegon saw more profit in a tie to Tarash, perhaps because of its fleet would be of use if he made another attempt to conquer Dorne. Seems plausible enough, but a different tale claims that Daemon was not so much opposed to wedding Rohan of Tarash as he was convinced that he could follow in the steps of Aegon the Conqueror and Maegor the Cruel and have more than one bride. Aegon may have even promised to indulge him in this. Some of the Blackfyre partisans later claimed this was the case, but Daeron was of a different mind entirely. Not only did Daeron refuse to permit his brother more than one wife, but he also gave Daenerys his hand to Meryn Martell, part of the bargain to finally unite the Seven Kingdoms with Dorne. Whether Daenerys loved Daemon, as those who rose for the Black Dragon later claimed, who could say? In the years afterwards, Daenerys was never aught but a loyal wife to Prince Meryn, and if she mourned Daemon Blackfyre, she left no record of it. So, but in the end, years of such talk bore their fruit. Daemon Blackfyre made his decision, yet it was the decision he made rashly, for word soon reached King Daeron that Blackfyre meant to declare himself king within turn of the moon. We do not know how word came to Daeron, though Marion's finished the Red Dragon and the Black suggested another of the great bastards, Brynden Rivers, was involved. So, just to pause real quick on that. So, we've got all sorts of events where Bittersteel is talking to Daemon. Clearly, I think we can take as a fact that it took some amount of time to completely convince Daemon. But one of the things that comes to mind as sort of confusing to me would be, so if, let's say Daemon makes his decision, why would he pause? What does he need to wait for Does he need a coup d'etat, which is going to take some amount of time? What is the reason for why he would be crowned within a fortnight or within the turn of the moon? And why essentially would there be enough time for Daemon to make this decision and then also to get caught on it and have to escape? So, King sent the King's Guard to arrest Daemon before he could take his plans for treason any further. Daemon was forewarned, and with the help of the famously hot-tempered knight Sir Quentin Ball, called Fireball, he was able to escape the Red Keep safely. Daemon Blackfire's allies used this attempted arrest as cause for war, claiming that Daeron had acted against Daemon out of no more than baseless fear. Others still named him Daeron Falseborn, repeating the calumny that Aegon the Unworthy himself was said to have circulated in the later years of his reign, that he had not been sired by the king but by his brother, the Dragon Knight. So, in this manner did the first Blackfire Rebellion begin in the year 196 AC. So, they fight battles. There's the Red Grass Field, which I've already gone through that, and there's better allusions to it in the Duncan Egg novella, so I may go through some of those in a separate episode, but this episode's getting to be long enough anyway, so, but what's interesting is, so, at the Red Grass Field, what essentially happened, so, for all their valor in the field, enmity towards Daeron, theirs was a lost cause. Daemon and his eldest sons, Aegon and Aemon, were brought down beneath the withering fall of arrows sent by Brynden Rivers and his private guards, the Raven's Teeth. This was followed by Bittersteel's mad charge with Blackfire in hand as he attempted to rally Daemon's forces. Meeting with Bloodraven in the midst of the charge, a mighty duel ensued, which left Bloodraven blinded in one eye and sent Bittersteel fleeing. So, and then battle comes to an end when Prince Baelor Breakspear appeared with a host of Stormlanders and Dornishmen, following on the rebel rear, while Maekar rallied Lord Aaron's van, made an anvil against which the rebels were hammered and destroyed. So, and then in the aftermath, King Daeron showed a sternness that few expected. Many lords and knights who supported the Black Dragon had lands and seats and privileges stripped from them, forced to give over hostages. Daeron had trusted them, had done all he could to rule justly, and still they turned against him. Daemon Blackfire's surviving sons fled to Tarosh, their mother's home, and with them went Bittersteel. The realm would continue to be troubled by the claims of the Blackfire pretenders for 4 more generations until the last of the descendants of Daemon Targaryen through the male line were sent to the grave. Yeah, and then, so they go over this very quickly in this, and this is where I had heard about this, but, and again, if you don't want to be spoiled on what will happen in likely season 1, maybe season 2 of the Duncan Egg thing, but likely season 1 is, everyone thinks Baelor Breakspear is going to be a great king, and you really see why when what happens in the first novella is that Aerion Brightflame, who, interestingly enough, I'd only ever heard him talked about as one of essentially the crazy Targaryens who had dragon dreams, but in the first novella, he's much less of a dreamer than his brother, his older brother, Daeron. And he's essentially just a regular sort of, much more closely to Daemon Targaryen, essentially, like our Daemon from House of the Dragon. And so, yeah, but what happens is that dude is essentially bullying somebody, and then Dunk sort of pulls him off and is beating the shit out of Aerion Brightflame, and then that causes sort of a trial by combat, which Baelor Breakspear ends up joining on Dunk's side, and all these sorts of things. And I believe it's the Baratheon is also there, that the Laughing Storm, wherever. So Dunk has some help on his side, but he fights against Maekar and Daeron and Aerion and a few others, and in a battle, and then essentially what happens is Makar basically brains his brother with a mace, and when his brother takes his helmet off at the end of the thing, his brain falls out, or something falls out of his head, and he dies. Right after he basically takes Dunk into his service, tells him the realm needs good men, etc. But what I think is really interesting about Baelor Breakspear in particular is, so when we see him first, it's because Dunk has been brought before him to sort of explain, hey buddy, like, why'd you put a hand on the Prince of the Realm sort of thing? And of course, Baelor is also a prince, so he's a prince judging the matter of the prince, etc. And his nephew, who is Egg, had brought this to him, but not directly. And so he sort of shows his wisdom and his just nature and all these sorts of things when he points out that it's basically like, well, you know, if this was happening where this prince was bullying this woman, etc., well, then the appropriate action from Aegon is not to go get the head knight to go help out this person. It's to come get me because, you know, I am the one who's going to make these decisions. I'm ruling here while Daron is back at court, not at the thing. So Baelor basically has the decision-making power within that area. And he points out to his son and to Dunk, he's like, hey, I know it might have seemed to be the right thing for Aegon to come to you, but in reality, he needs to come to me, and we need to do things the right way. But then, via his actions of taking the field on Dunk's behalf, etc., he sort of acquits himself, and the way he sort of games the whole thing out with essentially distracting the Kingsguard that are fighting on the other side of the trial by 7 to essentially know that they can't attack him. And then unfortunately it seems like he didn't tell his brother not to beat his fucking brains out. But you know, what's interesting is just for a character who spends so little time on screen that you don't see for very long, you get very wrapped up in his sort of storyline. And I think this is the case we can see it in House of the Dragon right now with somebody like Rhaenyra, where, right, like, I think we know, so her children who are going to essentially continue to propagate the Targaryen line, they're already born. And so from a strictly point A to point B, trying to get from the past to the present, that is the Game of Thrones universe where Dany is alive and active with her dragons and all these sorts of things, you almost say, like, well, no offense, but who cares about, you know, what happened before? Greens versus black versus red dragon, etc. You know, who cares? Like, that doesn't have any bearing on the modern world of the story where, you know, the dynamics are different. And I think something that could be demonstrated, though, just based on what I read in the Dance of the Dragons chapter with Tyrion, is, first of all, there may be more Blackfire stuff going on, so in the present world that wasn't explored by the show. So there may be essentially more occasion for examination into those things. But I think as a fan of the original show, it's sort of interesting to note how these shows and whatever, they get you to be invested in characters that you essentially wouldn't have even thought would have crossed your radar. Baelor Breakspear, you know, he only has like a couple chapters essentially in this where they say, you know, Baelor Breakspear cut down in his prime by his own brother Makar at the tourney of Ashford in the year 209 AC. He was not in the tilt of the melee, but in a trial by 7, in which Baelor fought on behalf of a lowly hedge knight, no parentage of note. His death was a mishap, almost certainly. It is written that Prince Makar always bitterly regretted Baelor's passing, marked its anniversary every year. Yet Baelor died. Doubtless Makar and the realm wondered if one hedge knight was worth the loss of the Prince of Dragonstone in the hand of the king. but then they did not know how high that hedge knight would rise, though that is a different story, so I don't want to spend too much time on that, where, yeah, I think we've gone over plenty of details here, and I've kind of gone over some of the things that I'm interested in as far as the Dunk and Egg novellas. But here, I'm about an hour and 15 minutes in, so I actually have two different things to go over at this point. So the first one I think I'm just going to go over really quickly, and it's basically an idea for me to write a Quentin Ball story. So again, the Fireball dude, which I'm going to try and see if I can find him in the World of Ice and Fire, in terms of if there's like a summary of the house and maybe another mention of him. But I wanted to sort of theorize about basically I wanted to write the story, and the title that came to mind was Escape of Fireball Damon's Flight. And it would be based on novella 3 from Dunk and Egg, where essentially you have this dude who's either pretending or truly probably the bastard son of Fireball, and he's allegedly part of this conspiracy, and it gives you sort of an insight into the Blackfire things, and there's some people basically being like, well, is he a true son of Fireball? What is his character? Da-da-da-da. That dude acquits himself pretty well, but I just thought, let's see. Well, so I guess the important thing about Quentin Ball is that he's killed by an archer at a stream, so obviously that has a little bit of a hint of the scent of Bloodraven to it. But, so, what I'm interested in, though, is, so we saw, and I think this is the interesting detail, if Daemon Blackfire intended, future tense, intended to get himself crowned king within the fortnight, whatever, Moon's turn, whatever the timing of it is, raises certain questions. Like, the first question comes to mind is, why wait? Why not do it right now? Are you waiting for something in particular? What is this, an Ides of March situation? What are we doing here? Like, why are we waiting? So that's something that comes to mind. And then another thing that comes to mind is essentially, where is Daemon when Darren sends the Kingsguard to arrest him? Presumably what you would assume is that he's in the Red Keep somewhere. Now, if he's in the Red Keep before he's engaging in treasonous activities, you wouldn't say that Daemon was going to be in any danger. But then, although this is contingent, because I guess if Daemon has already been given his lands and stuff, perhaps he's at his lands, and that's why it's going to take him a while to crown himself king. That's a possibility, but one thing that I think would be interesting would just be the idea perhaps he's still reluctant, and I think the reason for that would ultimately be because he's a dragon dreamer, and he's having certain hesitations based on certain dragon dreams that he's had. But the way I was thinking of it is, I was like, well, if Daemon Blackfire was in the Red Keep, and then Fireball is responsible for his escape, and I've heard a bunch of times, like, we don't have the details on how they escaped. Well, presuming they escaped from the Red Keep, what you would assume, if they didn't get caught by the Kingsguard and didn't pay off a bunch of people, what you would presume then is that they escaped via the secret sort of labyrinthian system within the Red Keep that is essentially the secret of Maegor the Cruel, who slew all the workers so that none of the details would be known. But clearly there are characters like Varys, for example, who know how to navigate these things, and you see it with Tyrion, for example. Like, Tyrion Tyrion has to follow very specific instructions from Varys when they're in the tunnels, lest he get lost. And there's all these sorts of potential things where you could. The show Prison Break came to mind, but basically the idea would be, okay, so what has happened is that Daemon has essentially decided he's going to declare for king, and he's told certain people, that he's going to declare himself king, but he hasn't put the plan into motion yet. And then what I would guess would be, it probably wouldn't be Bittersteel blabbing it directly to Bloodraven, but maybe you could see Bittersteel giving Bloodraven something to be like, hey, you need to be watching out for Daemon, something's going to happen here. And then, we see the thing of the Blackfire people, some of them saying, well, Darren arrested Daemon for no good reason, but it's like, if he's betraying the king, I'd assume then they're not, arresting him for no good reason. They're arresting him for a very good reason. He wants to kill the king. What? So that's sort of, but that almost might be like Donald Trump level political trolling, where it's like, yeah, those people know they're assholes and they're just making ill faith arguments because they have no shame, essentially. So then sort of my idea, though, was that, so if Fireball is responsible for getting Daemon to safety, and Daemon was in the Red Keep, it would assume then that what Fireball did is Fireball is another one of these characters who's essentially familiar with the system within the Red Keep, can take advantage of it, and can essentially lead Daemon to safety. And I was going to think of it as more of an odyssey, so a lot of travails and perils with, one goal, which would be to, free the king, and then I guess you could sort of flash forward to sort of the cracking of Aerys Targaryen at Duskendale, in terms of comparing the single-mindedness of a Barristan and Selmy to the single-mindedness of a Fireball, where the whole thing that they're trying to do is they're trying to save the king, and Fireball thinks that Daemon should be king, whatever, and Aerys, Barristan believes Aerys is the king and wants to rescue him as befits his Kingsguard oath, etc. And so I think you could frankly do a lot of details with just all right, story starts essentially. Quentin Ball is, he's in these tunnels and he's having to navigate this, that, and the other. Maybe he's having to deal with something more along the lines of magic, essentially, some shit going on, who knows. But so Quentin Ball traverses I don't know why I said traverses treasure and traps. Oh, Quentin Ball traverses treasure and traps through the magic maze of the Red Keep. So again, I just messed myself up because you don't usually see traverses, treasure, and traps right after each other. But that makes grammatical sense, because Quentin Ball traverses treasure. Because what I'm saying, though, is that I guess one of the distracting things would essentially be that whether booby traps or whatever is going on in those sort of in the tunnel system, potentially, that one of the things could be, they try to trick people with all this treasure, so that if the silly people actually get into there, the first thing that somebody who's just trying to make a buck in those walls is going to do is they're going to walk into the first trap that's just an apparent treasure that's not treasure. So then there would be sort of the contrast between Aerys and Daemon Blackfire. Essentially, what would be different between Barristan Selmy rescuing Aerys and Fireball rescuing Daemon is theoretically Daemon does not need rescuing from physical danger. Daemon is the warrior with sword in hand, so presumably if he has Blackfire, he's going to be a very hard person to sort of just arrest with Kingsguard. So then that raises the other question again of, if Daemon was in the castle, why would he need to run? Now, potentially the resolution of this is Daemon wasn't in the castle, but I'm kind of assuming he was for this idea. So then you've got the contrast between Aerys and Daemon Blackfire, where you'd say, oh, well, Aerys sort of has the Targaryen look to him and all this, but he's mad, and then Daemon, he's the one who's, he's really the Targaryen we were looking for, and therefore, the sort of line of Darren, you can sort of make the comparison and say, perhaps this is part of what sort of the people on the Blackfire side of things were potentially either seeing in dragon dreams or whatever, is essentially this idea that if Darren and his children and their children rule, then the Seven Kingdoms will never be prepared in sort of the Viserys to Rhaenyra sense of, we need a ruler on the throne who can unite the realm. If they don't believe that, because, Darren's doing this, that, and the other, he's weak, etc., then it's just interesting, because then that could possibly explain to say, Darren, he needn't be saved, yet he has to be warned first, in sort of the same sense as why there's a race between when Aegon II, who's in the House of the Dragon thing, there's sort of the race to go find him in order to crown him, because the crowning him has to be done a certain way in front of the people, and then that sort of legitimates him as king and all these sorts of things. And so you could have a similar element from the television show in that episode, where there's the sort of mad dash between separate parties with differing agendas trying to reach Aegon to have influence on him. And then you could say something similar is happening, where it's basically like Fireball he's not going to Daemon because he believes Daemon's in danger. He needs Daemon to escape, because it won't be clean if Daemon, cuts his way out of the Red Keep and all these sorts of things. Some of them may pathetically afterwards say, oh, well, he basically tried to arrest blah, blah, blah. But the rest of them, I think, are going to be a little smarter than that. And so then to continue on, I have more ideas. So it's a race between Quentin Ball and Brynden Rivers, and time itself, basically, where what I'm kind of assuming is that Brynden Rivers becomes aware that Daemon intends to declare himself, and therefore the race is really between Bloodraven and Quentin Ball. Can Bloodraven reach the king and get him to imprison Daemon Blackfire before Quentin Ball reaches Daemon and tells him, hey, we need to get going right here and now? Because again, it's just the interesting question. If David's escaping, does that mean he needs to run? Why does he need to run? And then, so I have written here, Daemon must be king. He must unite the realm with strength. Bastard cannot sit the Iron Throne. And something of the dragon must be... I don't know what I wrote at the end there, but basically we're seeing this in House of the Dragon right now, where there's a lot of lords who are basically like, hey, if you put that son that we all know is the son of Harris Strong, if you put that motherfucker on the throne, like, the Iron Throne will literally reject him. Like, this is never going to work. You're not going to be able to put a bastard on the Iron Throne. And sort of the irony that I think, it literally doesn't matter which way you look at it. Even if he's legitimated, nothing takes away from the fact that Daemon Blackfire's parents were not married when he was conceived. Therefore, he's clearly a bastard of a certain sort. And so just claiming that Darren's a bastard, you'd probably be like, well, he's the best bastard we've got then. But again, I think Daemon, it has to be part of the motivation is these people thinking, well, Daemon must be king, not Darren. He has to unite the realm with strength. Bastard cannot sit the Iron Throne. And then Bloodraven will render the realm I don't know what I wrote there. Cursed. Render the realm cursed, as seen in the Dunk and Egg novellas. He relies on sorcery, evil magic. Yeah, so it's basically the idea that within, even you see in the second novella, that these sort of divisions between Black and Red Dragon have sort of continued through to the present day of that story, and therefore, even though there's a victorious king sitting in King's Landing, all these things, fundamentally the realm is not even seriously at peace because these Blackfire rebellions are going to kind of continue to convulse through the realm, and both the past and the future of it makes a big difference. And so, you can also see if any of the Dragon Dreams of the Blackfire supporters essentially said, hey, like, there's going to be a dude, Bloodraven, who's going to have even more power than he had before, then, yeah, so I have written here the flight of Fireball. I guess that's more alliteration. Then I have written here, matter of purity in Dragon Dreams. Daemon was a dreamer. He saw Baelor break spear, and he didn't fit the image of Aegon's dream. Basically, if Aegon, the original Targaryen, the Conqueror, had a dream of the sort of coming of winter and all these things that happen in the show, I don't know, I'm going to just continue with my notes here, but so Fireball had contempt for the weak Darren, no faith in Baelor. Eventually he and Bitter Steel convinced Daemon to take the throne. However, Fireball and Daemon don't see far enough. Bloodraven sees further, and therefore the need for escape essentially is that Bloodraven has the advantage that I think it's either you would have to reveal it or Fireball or Bittersteel, whoever, Daemon, becomes aware to be like, oh, Bloodraven can sort of see into the future. And then also an interesting note is that Quentin Ball was supposed to be a Kingsguard, and if Daemon was on the throne, then he would, and so that's another motivation. And Daemon, Quentin know if Darren rules, Aerys will follow, Bloodraven will rule. Too weak to face the darkness, essentially, would be the argument if they're getting sort of influence from Dragon Dreams. And then I would say like a potential sort of dialogue point that I think is interesting, and again, I came up with this completely on my own, so dismiss it as bullshit if you want, but I have here the dragon does not run, and this is sort of stolen a little bit from the Aemon thing from House of the Dragon, where, and it's not from House of the Dragon, but it's from one of the DVD extras where they're talking through the history of it, and basically Aemon tells Kristen Cole, he's like, the dragon doesn't sit behind castle walls and wait for wars to be fought. We fight with fire and blood. Like, so, the dragon does not run, said Daemon. The dragon must fly now, Fireball replied. So that's sort of my situating of it, is essentially, you could think of it as like Daemon is in court. Maybe he's there because he's got to do kind of one last thing to consolidate forces together, and he's already decided. But then essentially, once Quentin knows what's going on and knows he has to inform Daemon, he has no time to do it any other way but then to go through the tunnels in the castle, reach him as quickly as possible, and tell the dragon, like, you might not think that you need to run, but you need to fly right now. And then I wrote, point of contention, Bloodraven admits good King Darren is a bastard. Daemon thus should be king, but Bloodraven knows. So I guess part of what it could be is that you could almost say that sort of a laying of the trap sort of situation could happen with Bloodraven, where Bloodraven provokes either Bitter Steel or Quentin Ball or one of these other people, and basically tells them, he's like, yeah, with my foresight and my ability to see things, like, I know now that basically Darren is the child of Aemon Dragon Knight, and therefore Darren is not the legitimate king. And then if we're looking at Daemon, then he looks like the legitimate king. And then I have a note here, appearance is deceiving, Daemon looks like the conqueror, but Dany will be born of Darren's line. Bloodraven loved Daemon, called him killed him like Cargyle twins. So this would be basically saying, if Bloodraven said he had a brother he loved and Daemon is the brother he loved, then he ended up having to kill the brother he loved because he knew that the brother he loved would never sire the proper children to, and so Bloodraven essentially had no choice. He had to save the realm, and dragons would never spawn in the Blackfire line would essentially be, that would be the point of knowledge that Bloodraven would kind of have to have in order to, like, one of the things that Bloodraven essentially may be aware of is like, oh, like, I don't know how or which particular Targaryen it's going to be, but one of these Targaryens is going to bring back the dragons, and therefore it's going to have to be of Darren's line. And understanding that, and then having another angle of sort of the bitterness of having to kill somebody that you love. And so I've almost gone through all of the content I was going to go through for this episode, but then I realized I had written something down here as an idea, wanted to kind of go through it, but it's really quickly kind of 3 examples of appearance versus reality in Game of Thrones to sort of explicate Plato's sort of concept of appearance versus reality, World of Shadows versus the World of the Forms. But of course we're not really here for Plato, we're just using him to theorize about the Game of Thrones universe. But sort of the first example of this that I would put forward would be with Cersei Lannister, where when you look at Cersei, both in the book and in the show, but more so in the book, you'd say she is the image of a queen, and also the image of a good queen, because she's essentially able to, not only does she look the part, but if you weren't paying enough attention, you might mistake her for intelligent, essentially. And so she's sort of the image of a good queen and has sat that position for so long, but she is essentially rotten. She's sort of insane underneath, and therefore, she kind of looks like a true queen, and she was Robert's queen, all these sorts of things. But then when it comes to the Marjorie Tyrell situation, all these different situations, you would just say, she is essentially intended to be a foil, to be like, this is exactly what you don't do, essentially, if you're that sort of ruler. Then another example would be Rhaegar Targaryen, in the sense that if the dragon dreams and stuff were all sort of indicating that a dragon was going to emerge from Summerhall, all that, of the tragedy of it and all that stuff, that implies then that dragon is Rhaegar, seeing as Rhaegar will... But then, sort of the challenge of that is, well, Rhaegar's children were supposing, based on the story, that they're all dead, and therefore it's only Dany who's Rhaegar's brother, so that whole generation kind of gets wiped to the side, and then Dany is seen as the legitimate heir, although again, if Jon Snow ends up being the last of the Targaryens, then of course, by all the inheritance laws and everything, he would clearly be the heir to the realm in the exact same way that Maekar became the heir to the realm when previously he had just been a prince and all these sorts of things. But then, it's like when your brother dies and you don't have any children to go through, then it'll go through the brother. But if there are children, then it goes through those children. And so Rhaegar, he's supposed to be this image of the last dragon who really looked the part and all these sorts of things. But then clearly, sort of him getting crushed by Robert on the Trident is sort of a proof positive that no matter how virtuous he was, ultimately it's not his story as far as being the dragon of the Targaryen family. And then in sort of a similar line, I'd say you can cast Daemon Waters in Daemon Blackfire, that he looks to be the rightful king, and basically it would be like, yes, all indications from like sense perception and things that are going on in context would make you think, or susceptible to think, that Daemon really should be king and Darren shouldn't be king. But then you would essentially see that it would be like, no, like only somebody like Bloodraven can really see far enough to really understand, like, oh, no matter who looks to be the Targaryen, etc., at the end of the day, the person who rules is not necessarily the person who looks like they ought to rule. And in particular, you would say that in this case, especially what you see in the novellas, which I thought was really compelling, was the articulation of the argument by so many of the people who fought on the Blackfire side to essentially say, look, Daemon was the better man. Darren was a little softy and a weakling and all these things, and call him good if you want. He was too weak to hold the realm together, and only Daemon could have done that, and therefore Daemon should have been king. And then I think you can have the element, especially if some of Blackfire supporters are either Dragon Dreamers or have some access to that information, then you could definitely see them getting even more potentially like fanatically devoted to the idea that no, Daemon has to sit on the throne. And why does he have to sit on the throne? Because he is the heir that Aegon was looking for, etc., etc. So I think I've spent enough time, though, so I'm going to take this to a pause because I've been recording for quite a while. But that's just sort of an application of sort of the appearance versus reality idea, and just to use it to say, like, oh, Cersei, she appears to be the true queen, and Rhaegar appeared to be the answer to the prophecy he was obsessed with, and Daemon appears like he should have been king, but appearance is misleading. Appearance is not always indicative of reality, etc., and therefore there's some difference that needs to be explained. So maybe next time we'll get back into Plato's Phaedo and dive back into that. But that's been Pod 38. So thanks.